Cardiorespiratory histology slides. We really talk about your exams and quizzes that are coming up after that. It shouldn't take too much time. But I got to do this today because this lab is tomorrow. I want to make sure you have some time to think about it between today and tomorrow. Okay. I'll put a couple of handouts out. Now might be okay time to do it. Before we get started here. One handout is the study guide for the cardiorespiratory quiz. It's on Canvas, but it's two different documents, so I'll just put both here. The other one is tomorrow's lab. So I'll put them out here. Go ahead and get one now if you want. I'll leave them right here. Help yourself to one of each. I would take one.
Oh no, those? Not yet. I haven't. Sorry. I haven't changed. You're sweet. Thank you. I was just waiting till class was over.
All right. Well, spirometry is the study of breathing. When we try to do this, at least do a hands-on lab for this, some of you may go on to be respiratory therapists. Well, anyway, spirometer measures changes in lung volume. The max volume of lung in the airways in an adult is about 5 to 6 liters. So we can assess the volume of a lung. It's easy to predict. For example, the tallest person in your group is going to have the largest lungs, right? Because it's the anatomy, it's the proportion. Larger people, taller people have larger lungs, primarily because they have more tissue to oxygenate. Respiratory physiologists have defined a series of volumes and capacities that are easy to measure, and we can do it in the lab. These values are useful for some clinical assessment. So we'll talk about the clinical somewhat. Basically, spirometry is this. How well can you move air in and out of your lungs? If you have trouble breathing, there are ways that you can quantitate that trouble by looking at a spirometry. So how we monitor airflow, we have to breathe through your mouth. I know that the airway that it is taught is the nose, but it's easier to breathe over a mouthpiece that's through your oral cavity, not your nasal cavity. And I'll try to remind you this again tomorrow. Basically, we have to calibrate the machine. The most important part of the equipment is actually this, the airflow transducer. There's a diaphragm in there. It can monitor how much air flows past it, okay? And it sends a signal to the computer, and you can see it on the screen. This is just pumping a syringe that simulates airflow. I would say the second most important piece of information is this. This is the bacteriological filter that protects you from this. Because trust me, I've seen students misuse this. They put their mouth right on that thing. And they got their mouth breath germs all over that. It's like, well, didn't you watch me when I demonstrated it? I'll demonstrate it for you tomorrow. Didn't you hear the words that just came out of my mouth? I mean, put this between you and that for your protection, and it also keeps our things sterile. Okay, so that's pretty important. And don't forget your nose clean, okay? Because we want all the air being ventilated through your mouth. And so when you breathe through the machine, normal breaths versus a deep breath, here's how it's going to look. You're going to breathe in, breathe out. Let's get my pens here. So the procedure is pretty simple. Take 5 normal breaths. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. And the one just goes up and down. They call this tidal volume. And then you're going to be asked to take a max breath in. Breathe all the way in. And they're going to be asked to push all of it out. And then you should take 5 more normal breaths. Taking a super deep breath, you have to really exert yourself to get a max breath. And that's very important that you give a max effort so you get an accurate value. Okay, but anyways, that's typically what a spirogram looks like. And to define all the capacities and volumes, for example, tidal volume, that's like from here to here. Okay. That's about 500 ml. We call that our TV, tidal volume. I'm not going to write them all out if you have the table, but TV, tidal volume, it's about 500 ml. And they give you the average values. I won't write them on the board. It's about average 500 for adult males and females. I noticed that when we do this in lab, it increases to about 1 liter because I notice it's hard to breathe normally when you got a nose clip on and a big mouthpiece in your mouth and people are watching you. So, but typically it's supposed to be about 500. Okay, now you take a normal breath in, you have some reserve. You can take a deeper breath beyond that and breathe all the way in. And that reserve is called your inspiratory reserve volume. So that's like, here's the top of a normal breath in, but there's your max breath in right there. So that difference, I guess, call this number 1, call this number 2, IRV. That's your inspiratory reserve volume. It's about 3 liters for a man, 2 liters for a woman. On average, the female values are a little bit less because typically females on average are smaller than males, so they have smaller lung capacity. So move on to number 3, ERV. That's your expiratory reserve volume. So you have to really push all the air out till you're gasping, right? And get all the way down there, I mean, without collapsing your lung, just push all the air out. And that bottom value, I guess if you can compare it to like the bottom value of a normal breath out, on number 3, that's your ERV. Now the most important one is the vital capacity. I'll get to that. But this one, where you can't directly measure it unless you actually collapse the lung, is your residual volume. So imagine there's some, let me put axes here. There's a volume of air you cannot get out of your lungs unless you collapse the lung, right? And that volume is right here. It's the RV, residual volume. Because that air always resides in your lungs, residual volume. Can't get rid of it. Right? And it's good to always have some air in the lungs. So the air that you're bringing in and bringing out most of the time is just simply right here, this tidal volume. Like, you know, waves lapping on the beach with the tide, tidal volume. It's how it got its name. You can take these volumes and you can add them to like capacity. So the first one they have listed is TLC. So volume's over here, capacity is almost over here. Total lung capacity, TLC. So that would be like if you take the top mark here and go all the way to the bottom mark. That's everything, right? So what they do is they tell you how you can add it up. You can just add up all the volumes, right? The next one is vital capacity. That we can measure in the lab. You can't measure TLC in the lab because we don't have a direct way to measure RV in our lab. Okay, so you usually assume it's about 1 liter or 1.2 liters, but that's an assumption. But you can directly measure vital capacity, VC, vital capacity, because that's like basically from this top mark to this bottom mark here. So number 1. from the tube. And that you can either add the things up, you can add up the TV, the IRV, the ERV, or you can just directly measure it on your computer, which is what I suggest you do. Just measure from top to bottom and get your vital capacity. And to call it vital capacity, that's the capacity of life. That's the amount of air you can move in and out of your lungs. About 5 liters for a man, 3 liters for a woman. And maybe the max I've seen is about 6 liters as a tall guy, a tennis player. Like I said, the tallest person in your group is going to have the largest lung capacity. Okay, you can just expect that. You can even predict it, and we'll do that tomorrow. But just to go through the rest of these, inspiratory capacity. That would be like if you went from the bottom of a breath out and then all the way to the top. So it includes the IRV, and the TV. Just call that IC. And then you have functional residual capacity. I'll just go over here. That was part of the lecture. I said that's part of the breathing cycle. That's the end of a previous breath before you take your next breath. I said nothing moves, and this volume of air is really important. This is like a reserve of oxygen-rich air that's always in your lungs, regardless if you're breathing in or breathing out. Okay, see, it's a nice big mixing chamber. It has significance, it has a function. I'll tell you that later. But in terms of this lecture, I mean, you could do the math. You could say, oh, it's the ERV and the RV. That's your FRC. So at the end of a normal breath out, you have a lot of air in your lungs, about 2.5 liters or 2 liters. So that's a lot of air in your lungs at the end of a normal breath out. So those are the capacities and volumes that we can measure in the lab. But I do want to talk about some of the pathologies. And this is why you actually do pulmonary function tests. So let's talk about pathologies that can cause hypoxia. Because that's the concern when there's something wrong with this system. You can't breathe, the oxygen tension in your blood goes down. And that's something else you monitor. So there are 2 major categories of lung disease: restrictive, obstructive lung disease. Obstructive lung disease is also known as COPD, chronic obstructive lung disease. I'll just put obstructive here. For your lab tomorrow, if you've looked at it, I asked each group to have 2 subjects, 1 normal, 1 COPD. Of course, just any 2 people in your group who want to do it, fine. If you want to volunteer information to your group, say, hey, you know, I used to smoke, I smoke, I lived in Mexico City, anything where you think you might have some kind of indication of that, you're free to volunteer to your group, and you can call yourself the COPD subject. It's good to have a comparison between 2 people. This is why you do pulmonary function tests. Now, the difference between restrictive is in the word. Restrictive means it's difficult to inflate the lung. And so the ability to inflate a lung with air is compliance. That's the word right here. So compliance, a high compliance lung, it's easy to fill. That's good. All right. Now, diseases where lung compliance are reduced is called restrictive lung diseases. Basically, it's difficult to inflate a stiff lung. restrictive. The lung is restricted from inflating. For obstructive, well, first you got to know, normal breathing is quiet, and it resembles a whoosh of the air flowing. There are diseases which airflow is diminished because of increased airway resistance or other reasons. Those are considered obstructive. So when patients forcefully exhale, the air whistles, and you can hear the wheezing, even without a stethoscope. The wheezing sound can be heard because of the obstruction. All right. So usually what we see in obstruction is lungs, usually they're easy to inflate, but difficult to push the air out because of the wheezing. Easy to inflate, difficult to empty. And that's a problem because, you know, with the wheezing, difficult to empty, there's a lot of stale air that gets trapped in the lung. So on one end, it's just difficult to breathe in or out, difficult to inflate. The other one is difficult to deflate, basically. Now, some causes of these different diseases. Emphysema is considered obstructive. Emphysema lung. If you read my notes there, there's a destruction of the elastic fibers. You know, think about a balloon. If it's difficult to blow up the balloon, usually you stretch it out, right? Why does that help? Because you're reducing the elasticity of the balloon wall, so it's easier to inflate. Now here, you're destroying the elastic fibers from, say, toxic chemicals from cigarette smoke or anything. And so here's normal, here's kind of like you lose kind of the elastic fiber structure. So it's easy to inflate the lungs, but because you've lost the elastic recoil of the lung by destroying the elastic fibers, the air just becomes trapped in there. And then so normal oxygen tension where the blood picks up oxygen, is lost. There's not as much gas exchange going on there. What you have is, technically it's obstructive, but technically there's no obstruction. There's nothing blocking the airway. It's just, you can't deflate them. It kind of is the same thing. It's difficult to empty because there's no elastic recoil. All right. So what you've got is a destruction of alveolar walls. So instead of, like, say you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe you have just one big one, and that's not good. It's better to have more smaller ones. Here's a picture of under the microscope. Here's normal. There's emphysema lung. And you don't have to be a doctor to know this doesn't look good compared to that. Here you have the nice structure. You can see the alveoli. You can see the ducts, the bronchiole. I don't see anything here. It's just a big mess. I tried to point to one smaller, larger alveoli, and you think, oh, it's a large, it's a better one. It isn't. There's inefficient gas exchange happening there. And it's a diseased lung, and it doesn't look good. And there are other diseases. There's fibrotic. Fibrotic is considered restrictive. Fibrotic is where, what the fibrosis is scar tissue that restricts the lung from inflating. You can see that here. They thicken the wall there. And so it's difficult to inflate that lung. And because of that thickness, you've increased the diffusion distance that the gases have to cross. So that makes gas exchange inefficient. That's why you have low oxygen tension in fibrotic lung there. Edema is considered restrictive. Fluid accumulating in the lungs. Pulmonary edema. If you have fluid surrounding the structure you're trying to inflate, it's hard to inflate. Like take a balloon and just hold the balloon under the water right at the surface and try to inflate it. Okay, it's more difficult because the pressure of the fluid surrounding the air sacs. You also increase the diffusion distance. So it's just more difficult to inflate because of the fluid surrounding the alveolar spaces. That's why it's considered restrictive. Asthma is kind of the classic obstructive disease, where the bronchioles spasm and constrict due to maybe an allergic reaction to something. You have excessive bronchoconstriction due to the spasm. So you decrease alveolar ventilation. So there are tests you can do. One basic test, we already talked about this, how to calculate the volume of air. That's they call that minute ventilation. But one we'll do tomorrow is called FEV1. So let me have you take notes on this. This is how much air can you exhale in a second. So this is called forced expiratory volume, FEV1. The 1 is 1 second, because most people should be able to push most of the air in your lungs out in 1 second. You can time it, and you can graph it. So the procedure would be, if this is the question you're answering, how much air can you push out in a second? Well, the subject tomorrow who's doing it, you'll inhale all the way off the mouthpiece, then on the mouthpiece, you just blow it all out. So the graph is only showing you exhaled air. You can quantitate it and see if they can push out at least 80% in the first second. That's considered normal. And if you kind of graph it out, here's FEV1. Here's like, you push most of it out first. And then for the remaining seconds, you're like gasping to push every last morsel of air out of your lungs. So you got to do it for like, count, if you're not the subject, 1 banana, 2 banana, 3 banana. Because if they go and they stop, that's your max value. It's supposed to be up there. Okay, that's why, other people in your group watching the subject need to monitor this kind of thing. Make them redo it if they don't do it right. Push it out, for the proper amount of time. Make sure you're gasping it all out of there. You get a max value, a true max. Okay. So that way you can calculate. We're not going to do FEV3. But if you calculated the max value, how much did they push out? That's FVC, forced vital capacity. That's all the air. That's your vital capacity. That's all the air you could push out. And the key is F, forced. You can't sit there and not try. You have to use all your muscles and effort. It's kind of like if you had to bench press 300 pounds. If you just, you'd be crushed, you'd die. It's the same thing for this. Your effort has to be max. You have to go, you really have to try for this thing to look correct. And what we say is, when you calculate FEV1, if it's 80% of your max, normal. Okay, and I'll go through the math with you tomorrow. 80% is normal. So if you look at the spirogram, I got this from another book. What is obstructive? I got it reversed there. Here's obstructive first, restrictive second. Basically, this is what you see. Look at obstructive. The total lung capacity is actually normal. Because the problem isn't, the capacity. The problem is you can't empty the lung. So when you take a breath out, you wheeze it out. Do you see this line, how it kind of has that slope? It should be more vertical, straight up and down. But because you can't push the air out, it's kind of sloping down like that. And you can't push all the air out. You get all this area where it's like, all this here, all this air is like trapped in the wall. Okay, that's what you get for obstructive. I wrote that over here. Air is trapped in the wall. So how you might see it is FEV1. FEV1 may be reduced, or VC may be reduced because it's just difficult to empty it. So write that down. Decrease VC, decrease FEV. There's an obstruction, hard to get the air out. Maybe the FEV1 is less than 80%. All right, for restrictive lung disease, the problem is capacity. You can't even inflate the lung all the way. So the spirogram appears like squished down, right? So you have less, basically you can't measure TLC, but less vital capacity. Oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Look at my nose all mixed up. Okay, yeah, that's okay. We'll stick with that. This one, this is a mistake on this side. Let me correct that. Actually, no. Let's just leave it. I'm having a brain fart late in the lecture here. This is all correct. But the main thing you'll see tomorrow, this may appear normal. FEV1 may appear normal. Because there's no obstruction, so all the air whistles out fine. It's normal. But because the whole thing is squished, expect that VC, vital capacity, will be reduced. And that's the thing I was trying to say. This is normal, that's reduced for restrictive. So what I did was I put spirograms that are for obstructive and restrictive on this slide, and I put a red line from top to bottom because that red line represents 1 second. Okay. For obstructive, you don't push out very much in the first second, so it appears that there is an obstruction. For restrictive, you push it all out. There's no obstruction, but it's like your total capacity is like shrunk. Okay, that's what I was trying to show you here. All right. And that concludes that. Thanks for your patience, but believe it or not, I have one more thing to present. I was trying to avoid a day like this all term. I couldn't do it. Usually how I did it before is I would lecture in places where there was no lecture scheduled, but now we're at the end, I have nowhere to push things, so this is what you've been subjected to. So thank you for your patience. I have the time. It's just, I know how much students can intake in one day, and I may have exceeded it. So I'm going to change my camera here.